Sometimes, the most unexpected bonds form in the unlikeliest of places. Deep in the heart of a quiet American town, where life was simple and routines rarely broken, a tragedy was brewing that would forever change the lives of one family. A little girl, a majestic lion, and a web of secrets. This is the story of Sarah, Aslan, and the heartbreaking twists of fate that entwine them. Stay tuned to discover a tale of innocence, betrayal, and the enduring power of love. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over Oak Ridge Zoo, a modest sanctuary nestled on the outskirts of a small town. Linda, a dedicated zookeeper, hummed softly as she prepared meals for the animals. Her 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, tagged along, her laughter filling the air as she hopped between the enclosures. "Mommy, can I say hi to Aslan?" Sarah's bright eyes sparkled with excitement. Linda glanced at her daughter and smiled. "Of course, sweetie. But remember, stay on the path. Don't get too close to the fence." Aslan, the zoo's pride, a majestic lion with a thick golden mane, lay languidly in his enclosure, but his ears perked up at the familiar sound of Sarah's voice. She was his favorite visitor, often sitting by the fence and chatting away as if he could understand every word. Sarah approached with her tiny hands gripping the bars, her voice soft but cheerful. "Hi, Aslan. Guess what? I brought you a treat." She held up a plush toy, a gift from her mother, to show him. The lion lifted his head, his deep amber eyes locking onto hers with what seemed like genuine interest. He let out a low rumble, not threatening, but warm. A sound Sarah swore was his way of saying hello. "Looks like he missed you," Linda said, joining her daughter. "Of course he did. We're best friends, right, Aslan?" Sarah giggled as the lion padded closer, settling himself near the fence. Their bond was unique, and though Linda knew the risks of letting her daughter interact with such a powerful animal, she couldn't deny the special connection they shared. She had worked at Oak Ridge Zoo for nearly a decade and had never seen Aslan behave so gently with anyone else. But behind the serene scenes at the zoo, trouble was brewing. A new employee, Rick, had joined the staff, bringing with him a cloud of unease. From the first day, his gruff demeanor and dismissive attitude toward animal welfare had sparked whispers among the team. "Linda, have you seen Rick's reports on Aslan's care?" asked Emma, another zookeeper, as they stood by the break room. Linda frowned. "No. Why?" Emma hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's cutting corners. The animals aren't getting the attention they need. And I heard him complaining about Aslan being spoiled." Linda's stomach nodded. She knew Aslan's care required diligence. A lion wasn't just a zoo attraction. He was a living, breathing creature with needs and feelings. That evening, Linda found Rick near Aslan's enclosure, holding a cattle prod. The sight froze her in place. "Rick, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The man turned, his expression cold and unapologetic. "The lion's getting too comfortable. Needs to be reminded who's in charge." "You call this animal care?" Linda snapped. "If you lay a hand on him, I'll report you." Rick glared but backed off, muttering under his breath. Linda's hands shook as she watched him walk away, a sense of foreboding settling over her. A few days later, Sarah ran to her parents during dinner, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy, Mommy, Rick hurt Aslan. I saw him with a stick, and Aslan looked so scared." Mark, her father, looked up from his plate, skeptical. "Sarah, maybe you misunderstood." "No," Sarah interrupted, her small fists clenched. "I saw it. He was being mean." Linda placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I believe you, sweetheart, and I'll make sure he doesn't hurt Aslan again." True to her word, Linda reported Rick to the zoo's management, and he was promptly dismissed. As he left, Rick's parting words sent a chill through her. "You think you've won? Just wait. I'll show you what real trouble looks like." In the days following Rick's departure, Aslan seemed more at ease, and Sarah's bond with him grew stronger. Linda often let her daughter accompany her during feeding times, believing the moments they shared with Aslan were harmless. One afternoon, While playing near Aslan's enclosure, Sarah spotted a large rock within the fenced area. "Mommy, look, I'm climbing to get closer to him," she called, already scrambling up the rock. Linda, preoccupied with a nearby task, glanced over too late. "Sarah, no, be careful." As Sarah reached the top, her foot slipped, and she tumbled into the enclosure. Time seemed to freeze as Linda's scream pierced the air. Inside the fence, Aslan sprang to his feet. His movements were fluid and purposeful as he approached the crumpled figure of the little girl. To Linda's shock, the lion didn't act aggressively. Instead, he crouched near Sarah, shielding her with his massive body as if to protect her from unseen harm. "Help! Somebody, help!" Linda cried, tears streaming down her face. Zoo's staff rushed to the scene, tranquilizing Aslan to retrieve Sarah. As the tranquilizer dart struck him, the lion let out a deep, mournful roar. His eyes locked on the unconscious girl as he collapsed. At the hospital, the prognosis was grim. Sarah had suffered a severe head injury and slipped into a coma. As Linda held her daughter's hand, Mark paced the room, his anger simmering. "This is your fault," he snapped, his voice trembling with rage. "You let her near that animal." Linda's heart broke, but she couldn't argue. She felt the weight of her choices crushing her spirit. Mark's anger grew into hatred for Aslan. When questioned by the authorities, he claimed the lion had attacked Sarah, painting him as a dangerous predator. The zoo's management, eager to avoid a PR disaster, decided to transfer Aslan to a high-security facility. The lion's departure marked the beginning of a downward spiral. Aslan's life became a nightmare of confinement and neglect, while Linda's guilt and Mark's bitterness poisoned their home. And so 3 long years passed. Would Sarah ever wake up? What would become of Aslan, the lion who had shown nothing but loyalty and love? Do you want to hear more of their story? The quiet hum of the hospital machines filled the room as Linda sat by Sarah's bed. Her once vibrant daughter now lay still, her small frame enveloped by a tangle of wires and monitors. Linda's hands trembled as she reached out to smooth Sarah's hair, her voice breaking into a whisper. "Sweetheart, please, wake up." 3 years had passed, but the guilt felt as fresh as the day Sarah had fallen. Every moment replayed in Linda's mind. The rock, the tumble, the lion's mournful roar. Mark's accusations had carved a permanent wound in her soul, and his bitterness only grew more venomous with time. Mark rarely visited Sarah anymore. When he did, his presence was cold and fleeting. His resentment toward Linda had festered into outright disdain, and their once loving marriage was now a battlefield of sharp words and icy silences. "I told you this would happen," he had spat the last time he visited. "You and that damned lion ruined everything." Linda had no response. Her grief and shame had swallowed her voice. Over time, she found solace in the bottle, each sip dulling the ache in her chest but amplifying the chaos in her life. Meanwhile, far from Oak Ridge, Aslan's life had turned into a living nightmare. Transferred to a rundown facility in another state, the lion's days were filled with neglect and abuse. He was kept in a cramped cage, poked and prodded by dispassionate staff, his once proud mane now matted and thin. "Move, you stupid beast," barked one of the keepers, shoving a metal rod through the bars of Aslan's cage. The lion let out a low growl but didn't retaliate. His spirit was broken, but his instinct to protect had not faded. Every night, Aslan dreamed of Sarah, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her presence. Those memories were all that kept him alive. His roar echoed through the facility at odd hours, haunting the staff and unnerving the other animals. "Why does he keep doing that?" one of the workers muttered. "Who knows? Maybe he's gone crazy," another replied. But it wasn't madness. It was longing. Back in Oak Ridge, Sarah's room was untouched, a shrine to the little girl who had once filled the house with joy. Linda rarely entered it anymore, afraid of the memories it stirred. Mark, on the other hand, seemed determined to erase every trace of his daughter's connection to the lion. One evening, Linda stumbled into the living room after another round of drinks. Mark sat on the couch, flipping through an old photo album. His expression was unreadable, but his grip on the book was tight. "Mark, what are you doing?" Linda slurred, her voice thick with alcohol. He didn't look up. "Looking at what we lost." "What you lost us?" The words cut deep, but Linda was too numb to respond. She sank into a chair, clutching a bottle as tears welled in her eyes. "Why do you hate me so much?" she whispered. Mark finally looked at her, his eyes filled with cold fury. "Because you chose that animal over our daughter. You let her get close. You let this happen." Linda's tears spilled over. She had no defense. Deep down, she blamed herself too. But what Mark didn't know, what Linda had never told him, was the truth about that day. She had seen Aslan's actions. She had seen him shield Sarah, his massive body positioned protectively as if to guard her from harm. The lion hadn't been a threat. He had been her savior. Yet Linda had remained silent, afraid of Mark's anger and the backlash it would bring. As weeks turned into months, Linda's silence became unbearable. She began visiting a local support group for struggling parents, hoping to find a glimmer of hope in her darkened world. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Linda found herself walking to the zoo. It was late, and the gates were locked, but she pressed her hands against the cold metal bars, staring into the shadows. "I'm sorry, Aslan," she whispered. "I failed you too." In her heart, Linda knew she couldn't undo the past, but she vowed to make things right. For Sarah, for Aslan, and for herself. Meanwhile, Sarah's condition remained unchanged. The doctors were hopeful yet cautious, their words carefully chosen to avoid giving false hope. "There's still brain activity," one of them explained during a checkup. "But after 3 years, it's hard to say if she'll wake up." Linda refused to accept that possibility. Every day, she sat by Sarah's side, talking to her, singing lullabies, and reading her favorite stories. "Do you remember the lion, sweetheart?" she murmured one afternoon. "Your Aslan? He misses you so much, just like I do." Mark, on the other hand, had given up hope entirely. He had begun distancing himself from the family, often staying out late or disappearing for days at a time. Linda suspected he was seeing someone else, but she no longer had the strength to confront him. One stormy night, as thunder rolled across the sky, Linda found herself once again at the zoo. She climbed the fence, ignoring the rain soaking her clothes, and sat near the now empty enclosure where Aslan once lived. "I'll fix this," she whispered. "Somehow, I'll fix this." As if in response, a distant roar broke through the night. Linda froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was Aslan. Though hundreds of miles away, the lion's instinct to reach Sarah remained unbroken. His roar carried across the winds, a haunting reminder of a bond that couldn't be severed. At the hospital, Sarah's hand twitched. It was so subtle that the nurse on duty didn't notice, but her monitors flickered briefly. Deep within her subconscious, Sarah heard the roar. It was familiar, comforting. A call she longed to answer. Her fingers moved again, this time more deliberately. The battle for Sarah's life was far from over, but the connection between her and Aslan had not been lost. Linda felt it. Aslan felt it. And somewhere in the depths of her coma, Sarah felt it too. Would the family ever find redemption? Could Linda bring herself to fight for the lion that saved her daughter? The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the roof of the hospital. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the kind of silence that only seemed to exist in places where hope hung by a thread. Linda sat at Sarah's bedside, her head bowed and her hands clasped tightly around her daughter's limp fingers. She had just come from the zoo, where she had heard Aslan's roar echoing through the storm. It was the first time in years she had felt a spark of something other than despair. A small flicker of connection to the lion she had failed so utterly. But now, sitting in the dim hospital room, doubt crept back in. "Mommy's here," Linda whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't give up on you, Sarah. I swear it." Suddenly, Sarah's fingers twitched. Linda's breath caught, and she leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Sarah? Sweetheart? Can you hear me?" But there was no further movement. Linda let out a shaky sigh, brushing Sarah's hair back gently. She didn't notice the slight flutter of her daughter's eyelids as she returned to her vigil. The next morning, Linda awoke to the sound of nurses bustling into the room. "How's she doing today?" asked one of them, adjusting the monitors. Linda shook her head. "The same. I thought she moved last night, but I guess it was just wishful thinking." The nurse offered a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes it takes a long time, but I've seen miracles before." Linda clung to those words like a lifeline. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of her guilt and the strain of the last 3 years pressed down on her once more. Meanwhile, Mark was growing increasingly hostile. He returned home late that evening, his shirt wrinkled and reeking of alcohol. "Where were you?" Linda asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Out," Mark replied curtly, slamming the door behind him. "Out where?" she pressed. He turned to her, his eyes cold. "Don't start, Linda. I've got enough to deal with without your nagging." Linda crossed her arms, her frustration boiling over. "You're her father, Mark. You're supposed to be here for her. For us. Don't you dare lecture me," he snapped. "You're the reason she's like this. You and that damn lion." The mention of Aslan struck a nerve. Linda's voice trembled with fury as she responded. "You know that's not true. He didn't hurt her. He tried to protect her. You're the one who lied and ruined his life." Mark's expression darkened. "You want to talk about lies? Linda? How about the ones you've been telling yourself? You're no saint. You let her get close to that animal. You're just as much to blame as anyone else." Linda flinched, but she refused to back down. "At least I'm trying to make things right. What have you done except run away and blame everyone else?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stormed out of the room, leaving Linda alone with her anger and sorrow. At the rundown facility where Aslan was kept, the lion paced restlessly in his cage. His mane was thinner now, and his body bore the marks of neglect, but his spirit had not been completely broken. He let out another low roar, his deep voice echoing through the halls. "What's with him lately?" muttered one of the keepers. "He's been noisier than usual." "Who knows?" replied another. "Maybe he's sick of this place. Not like it matters. He's just a stupid animal." But Aslan wasn't just an animal. He was waiting, hoping, and though he couldn't see her, he felt Sarah's presence, just as she felt his. Back at the hospital, Linda sat in the cafeteria, staring at the untouched coffee in front of her. She barely noticed when a woman approached her table. "Linda?" She looked up to see Emma, a former colleague from the zoo. It had been years since they'd spoken, but the sight of her old friend brought a wave of emotions. "Emma," Linda said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about Sarah," Emma replied gently. "I'm so sorry, Linda. I should have reached out sooner." Linda managed a faint smile. It's been a lot." Emma sat down across from her. "I also heard about Aslan. Is it true he's been locked up in that awful place?" Linda nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "They took him away after the accident. Mark told everyone he attacked Sarah, but he didn't. He was trying to protect her." Emma placed a hand on Linda's. "Then we need to do something. Aslan doesn't deserve this." Linda hesitated. "I don't even know where to start. Mark, he's against me. And I've made so many mistakes, Emma. I don't know if I can fix any of this." Emma's gaze was steady. "You can. But you need to fight. For Sarah, for Aslan, and for yourself." The words lingered in Linda's mind long after Emma left. That night, as she sat by Sarah's bed, she made a silent promise. "I'll make this right," she whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I will." The next morning, Linda noticed something different. Sarah's fingers twitched again, and this time her eyelids fluttered. "Sarah?" Linda gasped, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" A soft sound escaped Sarah's lips, almost a sigh. Then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, her eyes opened. It took a moment for Linda to realize what was happening, and when she did, she burst into tears. "Doctor! Someone! Come quick!" The nurses and doctors rushed in, their faces a mixture of astonishment and joy as Sarah's vitals stabilized. Linda clung to her daughter's hand, her heart racing with relief. "Mommy?" Sarah's voice was weak but unmistakable. "I'm here, baby," Linda whispered, pressing a kiss to Sarah's forehead. "I'm here." But then Sarah's next words sent a chill through the room. "Where's Aslan?" Linda's tears froze on her cheeks. The mention of the lion after all this time was like a lightning bolt. She glanced at the doctors, who exchanged puzzled looks. "Aslan's... He's safe, sweetheart," Linda said carefully. "You just focus on getting better, okay?" But Sarah's brow furrowed. "He needs me, Mommy. I heard him." Linda's breath caught in her throat. How could Sarah have known about Aslan's roar? Was it possible the bond they shared was deeper than she had ever imagined? The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Mark, who stopped short in the doorway. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of Sarah awake. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling. "Daddy," she whispered, her gaze meeting his. For a brief moment, Linda thought the sight of his daughter might soften Mark's hardened heart. But then his expression darkened. "What's this about Aslan?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You're not putting that nonsense in her head? Are you, Linda?" "She brought it up herself," Linda shot back. "And maybe it's time we told her the truth." Mark's jaw tightened. "The truth? Or your version of it?" "Enough!" Linda snapped, her frustration boiling over. "She just woke up after 3 years. Can we not do this now?" Mark clenched his fists but said nothing, turning and walking out of the room. Linda sighed, stroking Sarah's hair as she whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take care of everything." But in her heart, Linda knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The air in the hospital room felt heavier than ever, despite the newfound hope Sarah's awakening had brought. Linda sat by her daughter's bedside, still reeling from the intensity of their earlier exchange. Sarah's innocent question about Aslan had unlocked a flood of emotions Linda had buried for years. "Where's Aslan, Mommy?" Sarah asked again, her voice soft but insistent. Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He's somewhere safe, sweetie. But don't you worry about him now. You need to rest and get stronger." Sarah's small hand tightened around her mother's. "He needs me. I heard him." Linda's heart twisted. She wanted so badly to believe Sarah's words were just the remnants of a dream, a child's imagination running wild after years of silence. But the conviction in her daughter's eyes was undeniable. The door opened, and a nurse stepped in, breaking the moment. "Linda, the doctor would like to speak with you," she said gently. Linda nodded, kissing Sarah's forehead before stepping into the hallway. There, she found Dr. Simmons, the attending physician, waiting with a clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Carter, I wanted to discuss Sarah's progress with you," he began, his tone measured. "It's remarkable that she's woken up after so long. Her vitals are stable, but her motor skills and memory will take time to recover fully. She'll need physical therapy and a lot of emotional support." Linda nodded, absorbing the information. "Anything she needs, I'll do it," she said firmly. The doctor hesitated, then added, "I also noticed her mentioning a lion. Is that something significant to her?" Linda's throat tightened. "It is," she admitted. "Aslan. He was her favorite at the zoo where I worked. They were very close." Dr. Simmons gave her a curious look. "It's not uncommon for patients in comas to retain sensory memories. If Aslan was important to her, that connection could have played a role in her awakening." Linda's breath caught. Could it really be possible that Sarah's bond with Aslan had transcended the boundaries of time and consciousness? Later that evening, Linda returned home, exhausted but determined. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. She poured herself a glass of water, resisting the urge to reach for the bottle of wine tucked away in the cabinet. Mark's voice startled her. "How's she doing?" Linda turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "She's awake," she said simply. "She's asking about Aslan." Mark scoffed, stepping into the room. "Of course she is. You've been feeding her that fairy tale for years." "That's not fair," Linda shot back. She brought him up on her own. You weren't there, Mark. You didn't see the way they bonded. Mark's jaw tightened. I saw enough. That lion is dangerous, Linda. I won't let you drag her back into this nonsense. Linda's eyes narrowed. Dangerous? The only thing dangerous about Aslan was the lie you told to get rid of him. Mark's face darkened. I did what I had to do to protect my family. Maybe you should try doing the same. Linda's voice trembled with fury. Don't you dare lecture me about family, Mark. You've spent the last 3 years blaming me for everything instead of being there for Sarah. You let your guilt eat you alive, and now you're trying to rewrite history to make yourself feel better. The room fell silent, the tension crackling like a live wire. Finally, Mark turned away, his voice low. If you're smart, you'll let this go, Linda. Aslan's gone. He's not coming back. Linda watched him leave, her heart pounding. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let it go. Not for herself, not for Sarah, and not for Aslan. The next day, Linda returned to the hospital to find Sarah sitting up in bed, a faint smile on her face as she played with a stuffed lion. The sight brought tears to Linda's eyes. Mommy, can we go see Aslan? Sarah asked, her voice filled with childlike hope. Linda knelt by the bed, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's face. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Aslan. He's far away now. Sarah's smile faded. Did Daddy make him go away? Linda's heart ached. She didn't want to burden her daughter with the full truth. Not yet. He had to leave, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure he's okay. Sarah seemed to accept this, though the sadness in her eyes lingered. That evening, Linda reached out to Emma, her old friend from the zoo. They met at a quiet diner on the edge of town, their conversation hushed but urgent. Emma, I need your help, Linda began, her voice shaking. Aslan, he's not safe where they took him. I need to find him. Emma's brow furrowed. You know where he is? Linda nodded. The facility where they transferred him, Oakwood Wildlife Center. It's notorious for neglect and abuse. I've seen photos of the conditions there. He doesn't deserve that. Emma leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. This won't be easy, Linda. If you want to bring him back, you'll have to go through the courts or launch a campaign to expose the truth. Either way, you're going to face a lot of pushback. I don't care, Linda said firmly. I owe it to him. And to Sarah. Emma reached across the table, her hand resting on Linda's. Then I'll help you. But you'll need more than just me. You'll need evidence. Proof of what they're doing to him. Linda nodded, her resolve strengthening. I'll get it. Whatever it takes. That night, Linda began her research, poring over articles, photos, and reports about Oakwood Wildlife Center. The deeper she dug, the more horrified she became. Animals crammed into tiny cages, starved, abused, and forgotten. Aslan's face appeared in a grainy photo, his once proud mane ragged and his body thin. Tears streamed down Linda's face as she stared at the image. I'm so sorry, Aslan, she whispered, but I'm coming for you. Promise. The next morning, she shared her plan with Emma. They would infiltrate the facility, document the conditions, and rally public support for Aslan's release. It was risky, but it was the only way. As Linda prepared for the fight of her life, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, she had a purpose, a chance to make things right. And somewhere, miles away, Aslan let out a low, mournful roar, as if he too felt the tide beginning to turn. The morning light filtered through the blinds as Linda sat in her living room, surrounded by printouts and hastily scribbled notes. Her laptop buzzed faintly with open tabs showcasing articles and petitions about animal mistreatment at Oakwood Wildlife Center. Each photo and testimony deepened her resolve. Emma's voice crackled through the phone. Are you sure about this, Linda? Once we start, there's no going back. These places have connections, and they'll fight tooth and nail to protect their reputation. Linda's gaze hardened. Aslan doesn't have anyone else, Emma. He trusted me and I let him down. I won't fail him again. From the other room, Sarah's voice called out, breaking the intensity of their conversation. Mommy, can you help me brush my hair? Linda softened at the sound, walking into the room to find Sarah sitting cross-legged on her bed, holding a hairbrush. Her recovery had been slow but steady, each small milestone a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark journey. Linda gently took the brush and began untangling her daughter's hair. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Better. Can we go outside today? I want to feel the sun." "We will soon," Linda promised. "But first, I need to work on something very important. You remember Aslan, don't you?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Of course I do. He's my best friend. When can we see him?" Linda hesitated, her heart aching at the innocence in Sarah's question. "It might take a little time, but I'm working on it. I need you to trust me. Okay?" Sarah nodded solemnly, as if understanding the gravity of her mother's words. That evening, Linda met Emma near the edge of Oakwood Wildlife Center. They parked far from the facility's main entrance, their car hidden among the trees. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made every sound seem louder. "Do you have the camera?" Emma asked, pulling her coat tightly around herself. Linda held it up, her hands trembling slightly. "Yeah. Are you sure we won't get caught?" Emma smirked, though her eyes betrayed her own nervousness. "Not if we're careful. We stick to the shadows, get what we need, and get out. No heroics." The two women crept along the perimeter of the facility, their breath fogging in the chilly night air. The sound of barking dogs and the distant hum of machinery echoed faintly through the trees. They found a break in the fence and slipped inside, careful to avoid the security cameras perched on poles. The facility was even worse up close. Rows of rusted cages lined the grounds, their occupants pacing anxiously or lying listlessly in the dirt. The stench of waste and decay hung heavy in the air. Linda's stomach churned as she snapped photos of the conditions. "This is worse than I imagined," she whispered. Emma nudged her and pointed toward a larger cage at the far end of the lot. "There. That's where they keep the bigger animals." Linda's heart raced as they approached. In the dim light, she could make out a figure lying still in the corner of the cage. It wasn't until they were a few feet away that she recognized the matted mane and the familiar shape of Aslan. "Oh my God," Linda breathed, her voice breaking. "Aslan." The lion lifted his head weakly at the sound of her voice, his amber eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it was as if time stood still. Despite the years of separation and the torment he had endured, there was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet, aching recognition. "Aslan." "It's me," Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. Emma tapped her shoulder urgently. "Linda, we need to move. Someone's coming." Linda hesitated, torn between the desperate need to stay with Aslan and the reality of their situation. "I'll come back for you," she promised him, her voice trembling. "I swear it." The lion let out a low rumble, a sound that seemed to say he understood. They slipped away just as a security guard rounded the corner, his flashlight sweeping the area. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as they ducked behind a row of empty cages, holding their breath until the guard moved on. "Let's go," Emma whispered, tugging at Linda's sleeve. Reluctantly, Linda followed, her mind racing with plans for what to do next. The next day, Linda began organizing a campaign to expose the conditions at Oakwood. She reached out to local animal rights groups, shared her photos on social media, and even contacted a journalist who had written about the facility in the past. Her efforts gained traction quickly, with people rallying around Aslan's story. Comments flooded in from strangers who were outraged by what they saw. "This is horrific," one person wrote. "How can they get away with this?" "Justice for Aslan," another commented. But not everyone was supportive. Mark stormed into the house one evening, his face red with fury. "What the hell are you doing, Linda?" he demanded, slamming the door behind him. Linda stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm trying to save him, Mark. Someone has to." "Save him?" Mark scoffed. "He's just an animal. You're putting our family at risk for a lion." "No, Mark," Linda shot back. "I'm putting myself at risk to make up for what you did. You lied about him, and now he's suffering for it." Mark's fists clenched at his sides. "I did what I had to do to protect us. You think anyone would have believed the truth? That a lion was trying to protect her? They would have shut down the zoo and ruined our lives. Our lives were already ruined, Linda said, her voice breaking. And not because of Aslan. Because of you. The words hung in the air like a challenge. And for the first time, Mark didn't have a response. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. As Linda's campaign gained momentum, so did the threats from Oakwood. She received emails warning her to back off, and strangers showed up near her home, watching her from a distance. But Linda refused to be intimidated. One evening, as she sat with Sarah, her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Turn on the news," it read. Linda grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. A live report from outside Oakwood Wildlife Center filled the screen, showing activists and reporters gathered at the gates. "We're here today to demand justice for the animals being held in deplorable conditions," the reporter said. "One lion in particular, named Aslan, has captured the hearts of many after his story went viral." Linda felt a surge of hope. The world was finally paying attention. But she knew the fight was far from over. As she held Sarah close, Linda whispered, "We're going to bring him home, sweetheart. Promise." And somewhere, in the cold confines of his cage, Aslan let out another low roar, a sound of resilience and hope. The roar of the crowd outside Oakwood Wildlife Center grew louder as activists and reporters gathered in protest. Linda watched the live broadcast from her living room, her heart pounding. Signs waved in the air with slogans like, "Justice for Aslan," and "Shut down Oakwood." It was surreal to see strangers rallying behind the lion who had once been her daughter's closest companion. Sarah sat on the couch beside her, clutching her stuffed lion tightly. "Mommy, is Aslan going to be okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of worry. Linda knelt down to meet her daughter's gaze. "I'm going to do everything I can to bring him home, sweetheart. Promise." Meanwhile, inside the facility, Aslan's ears perked at the commotion outside. He paced restlessly in his cage, his amber eyes scanning the area as though sensing that something was about to change. The workers at Oakwood were visibly tense, their hurried movements betraying their unease. "Do you think this will blow over?" one guard muttered to another. "Not if that woman keeps stirring things up," his colleague replied, shooting a glance at the gates where the crowd continued to grow. In his cage, Aslan let out a low growl, his presence a reminder that even in his weakened state, he was not to be underestimated. Back at home, Linda's phone buzzed with a call from Emma. "Linda, it's working," Emma said, her excitement evident even through the static of the line. "The news coverage is bringing attention to Oakwood, but they're not going to back down without a fight." Linda frowned, her mind racing. "What do we do next?" "We need more proof," Emma replied. "Photos, videos. Something that shows the world exactly what's happening behind those walls. And we need it fast, before Oakwood starts covering their tracks." Linda hesitated. The thought of going back to that place filled her with dread. But she knew Emma was right. "I'll do it," Linda said finally. "I'll go back tonight." "You're sure?" Emma asked. "I have to," Linda replied, her voice firm. "For Aslan. And for Sarah." As the sun set, Linda prepared for her second trip to Oakwood. She dressed in dark clothing and packed a small bag with essentials. Her camera, a flashlight, and a notebook for documenting what she saw. Before leaving, she sat with Sarah one last time. "I'll be back soon, sweetheart," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Be careful, Mommy," Sarah whispered. Linda kissed her forehead. "I will." The drive to Oakwood was tense, the darkened roads amplifying Linda's anxiety. Emma met her at a secluded spot near the facility's perimeter, her own expression grim. "You ready for this?" Emma asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Linda replied, tightening her grip on the camera. The two women slipped through the same break in the fence they had used before, their movements cautious and deliberate. The facility was quieter than usual, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. They moved quickly, snapping photos and recording footage of the cramped cages and malnourished animals. Linda's heart ached with every shutter click, the weight of the suffering around her almost too much to bear. When they reached Aslan's cage, Linda froze, The sight of him lying motionless in the corner sent a wave of panic through her. "Aslan," she whispered, stepping closer. The lion lifted his head weakly, his eyes meeting hers. Relief flooded Linda's chest, but it was short-lived. Aslan looked thinner than before, his once proud mane now a shadow of its former glory. "We need to get him out of here," Linda said, her voice trembling. Emma placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will, but not tonight. Let's get this footage out there first." Linda nodded reluctantly, snapping more photos as Emma recorded a video. "This is Aslan," Emma narrated quietly. "A once mighty lion reduced to this because of neglect and cruelty. This is why we fight." As they turned to leave, the beam of a flashlight swept across the ground, and a voice barked, "Hey, who's there?" Panic surged through Linda as the women ducked behind a stack of crates. "We need to move," Emma whispered urgently. They crept along the shadows, their hearts pounding with every step. Just as they reached the fence, a guard spotted them. "Stop! Get back here," he shouted. Linda and Emma sprinted through the opening, adrenaline propelling them forward as the guard's footsteps thundered behind them. They dove into the woods, weaving between the trees until the sound of pursuit faded. Finally, they stopped to catch their breath, their hands on their knees as they gasped for air. "That was close," Emma said, her voice shaky. "Too close," Linda agreed, clutching her camera tightly. "But we got what we needed." The following morning, Linda uploaded the photos and videos to every platform she could think of. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the country shared their outrage, demanding justice for Aslan and the other animals at Oakwood. But the fight was far from over. Linda received an anonymous email that afternoon. The subject line read, "You've been warned." The message was brief but chilling. "Stay out of our business, or you'll regret it." Linda's hands trembled as she read the words, but she refused to be intimidated. Instead, she forwarded the email to Emma and the journalist who had been covering the story. "This isn't just about Aslan anymore," Linda said to herself. "This is about exposing the whole system." As the pressure on Oakwood intensified, Linda began preparing for the possibility of legal action. She contacted an animal rights lawyer who agreed to take the case pro bono. "This will be a long fight," the lawyer warned during their first meeting. "But with the evidence you've gathered and the public support behind you, we have a strong case." Linda nodded, her resolve unshaken. "I'm ready." At the hospital, Sarah was growing stronger each day. She began asking more questions about Aslan, her curiosity and determination mirroring her mother's. "Mommy, do you think Aslan remembers me?" she asked one afternoon. Linda smiled softly. "I know he does, sweetheart, and we're going to see him again soon. Promise?" Sarah beamed, her hope shining like a beacon in the darkness. That night, as Linda lay awake in bed, her mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't stop until Aslan was free. Somewhere far away, the lion let out another mournful roar, as if calling to the only people who had ever truly cared for him. Would their bond be enough to overcome the obstacles in their path? Linda woke to the faint chirping of birds outside her window, a rare sound of serenity in the whirlwind her life had become. The morning light spilled across her bedroom floor, but it did little to calm her nerves. She stared at her phone, scrolling through an endless stream of notifications. Messages of support poured in from strangers around the country, but there were also threats. The fight for Aslan's freedom was gaining momentum, but it was also drawing the attention of powerful opponents. In the kitchen, Sarah sat at the table, nibbling on a piece of toast. She was brighter today, her cheeks a little fuller, her voice a little stronger. "Mommy, can we go see Aslan yet?" she asked between bites. Linda paused, leaning against the counter. She wanted to tell her daughter the truth, that their fight was far from over, that Aslan was still trapped in a place that sought to break him. But she couldn't bear to dim Sarah's hope. "Soon, sweetheart," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's face. Very soon, at Oakwood Wildlife Center, tensions were reaching a boiling point. The protests outside the gates had grown larger, louder, and harder to ignore. Management scrambled to control the narrative, issuing vague statements about their commitment to animal welfare, but the evidence Linda and Emma had gathered spoke louder than words. Inside the facility, Aslan's condition was deteriorating. The lion had always been a symbol of strength and majesty, but now his once mighty frame was gaunt, his movements sluggish. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, there was still a fire in his eyes, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. "He's not going to last much longer if this keeps up," one worker muttered as he glanced at the lion's cage. "Not our problem," another replied with a shrug. "The bosses just want the protests to go away. If they can't, well, they've got other ways of dealing with him." The words hung in the air like a threat, a chilling reminder of the stakes. That afternoon, Linda met Emma at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was tense as they discussed their next move. "We need to escalate," Emma said, stirring her coffee absently. "The protests are great, but we need more. Something that forces them to act." Linda frowned, her mind racing. "Like what?" "Legal action," Emma said firmly. "We have enough evidence to file an injunction. If the court orders Oakwood to release Aslan, they'll have no choice." Linda's heart sank. "And if we lose?" Emma hesitated, then reached across the table to squeeze Linda's hand. "We won't. You've come too far to give up now." That evening, Linda met with the animal rights lawyer who had taken on Aslan's case. The lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Clara Hayes, wasted no time getting to the point. "We have a strong case," Clara said, spreading out a stack of documents on the table. "The evidence of neglect, the public outcry, the media attention. It all works in our favor. But we need one more thing to seal the deal." "What's that?" Linda asked. "A testimony," Clara replied. "Someone who can speak to Aslan's behavior, his bond with Sarah, and the circumstances of his transfer. Someone credible." Linda's stomach churned. "You mean me?" Clara nodded. "You were there when it all happened. Your voice could make all the difference." Linda's thoughts raced. The idea of standing up in court, of reliving the trauma of Sarah's accident and facing the lies Mark had told, was terrifying. But the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. "I'll do it," Linda said finally, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Clara coached Linda on what to expect, while Emma worked tirelessly to mobilize public support. Sarah, blissfully unaware of the legal battle unfolding, spent her days drawing pictures of Aslan and telling her mother stories about the adventures they would have when they were reunited. "Mommy, do you think Aslan remembers me?" Sarah asked one evening as she showed Linda a drawing of herself and the lion. Linda's throat tightened. "I know he does, sweetheart. You're unforgettable." The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Mark sat in the back, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Linda avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the task ahead. When it was her turn to testify, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Please state your name and your relationship to the lion known as Aslan," the judge said. "My name is Linda Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was a zookeeper at Oak Ridge Zoo, where Aslan lived before his transfer to Oakwood Wildlife Center. My daughter, Sarah, formed a special bond with him during that time." Linda recounted the events leading up to Sarah's accident, her voice breaking as she described the moment Aslan shielded her daughter with his massive body. "He didn't attack her," Linda said firmly, her eyes shining with tears. "He protected her, and he's been paying for that ever since." The courtroom was silent as Linda continued, detailing the conditions at Oakwood and the evidence she and Emma had gathered. By the time she finished, even the most skeptical faces in the room seemed moved. When Clara stood to deliver her closing argument, her voice rang with conviction. "Aslan is not just a lion. He is a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the bond we share with the animals in our care. He deserves better than a life of suffering. He deserves justice." The judge's decision came days later. Linda paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she waited for Clara's call. When it finally came, her heart raced. "Clara, It's done, Clara said, her voice tinged with relief. The court has ordered Oakwood to release Aslan into the custody of a sanctuary. He's free, Linda. Linda sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Sarah ran into the room, her eyes wide with excitement. Mommy, what's wrong? Linda pulled her daughter into a tight hug, her voice trembling with joy. Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Everything's finally right. At Oakwood, the staff prepared to transport Aslan to his new home. The lion stood tall in his cage, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon as if sensing that his long ordeal was finally coming to an end. And somewhere, miles away, Sarah clutched her stuffed lion and whispered, "We're coming for you, Aslan." The hum of the truck's engine filled the air as Aslan was carefully loaded into a reinforced transport crate. His amber eyes darted around, taking in the flurry of activity. The workers at Oakwood Wildlife Center were cautious, their movements deliberate as they secured the lion for his journey. Though thin and visibly worn, Aslan exuded a quiet dignity that seemed to unsettle even the most jaded among them. Is he sedated? One worker asked nervously. Lightly, another replied, just enough to keep him calm during the ride. Aslan's ears flicked at the sound of their voices. He wasn't sedated enough to be unaware. He could feel the shift in energy around him. For the first time in years, there was no hostility, no pain, only a strange sense of change. Back at home, Linda paced the living room, her nerves frayed as she waited for an update. The call from the sanctuary had come earlier that morning. Aslan was officially on his way. The relief she felt was almost overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't truly over. Mommy, when will Aslan get here? Sarah asked, peeking around the corner with her stuffed lion clutched tightly in her arms. Linda knelt down to meet her daughter's gaze. It'll take a little while, sweetheart. He's traveling a long way to get to his new home. But when he's ready, we'll go visit him. Sarah's eyes lit up. Can I bring him my drawings? Maybe he'll remember me if I show him. Linda smiled, her heart aching with love for her daughter. I think he'd like that very much. The truck carrying Aslan rolled along a winding road, flanked by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Inside the crate, the lion rested quietly, his body swaying slightly with the movement of the vehicle. For the first time in years, the air around him felt lighter, as if the weight of his captivity was finally beginning to lift. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression thoughtful. You think he knows what's happening? He asked his partner. The other man shrugged. Who knows? But I'll tell you one thing. I've never seen a lion look so calm. Aslan let out a low rumble, his voice soft but steady. It wasn't a growl of fear or aggression. It was a sound of resilience, a reminder of the strength that had carried him through years of suffering. At the sanctuary, preparations were underway to welcome Aslan. The facility, located in a sprawling expanse of protected land, was a world away from the harsh confines of Oakwood. Here, the animals roamed freely within large enclosures designed to mimic their natural habitats. Is the enclosure ready? Asked a staff member, checking the final details. Everything's set, another replied. This place is going to feel like paradise compared to where he came from. The head caretaker, a kind-eyed woman named Grace, stood by the gates, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the scene. Let's make sure this transition is smooth, she said. He's been through enough. When the truck finally arrived, Grace and her team moved quickly to unload Aslan's crate. The lion remained calm, his eyes scanning his surroundings as the unfamiliar sense of the sanctuary filled the air. This is it, big guy, Grace said softly, her voice carrying a soothing tone. Welcome home. The crate was carefully opened, and Aslan stepped out tentatively, his massive paws sinking into the soft earth. For a moment, he stood still, his head held high as he took in the wide expanse of his new enclosure. The golden sunlight bathed his fur, giving him an almost ethereal glow. Then, as if realizing the truth of his freedom, Aslan let out a roar, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. The sanctuary staff watched in awe as the lion began to explore, his movements slow but purposeful. It was a moment of triumph, a symbol of resilience and hope. When Linda received the call confirming Aslan's safe arrival, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Tears streamed down her face as she thanked Grace for her care and dedication. "We'd love to have you and Sarah visit," Grace said warmly. "I think he'd be happy to see you both." Linda's heart soared at the thought. "We'll be there soon." She hung up the phone and turned to Sarah, who was busy drawing another picture of Aslan. "Guess what, sweetheart?" Linda said, her voice filled with excitement. "What?" Sarah asked, looking up with wide eyes. "Aslan is safe. He's in his new home now." Sarah's face lit up with pure joy. "Can we go see him?" "Very soon," Linda promised, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. Over the next few days, Linda worked tirelessly to finalize the details of their visit to the sanctuary. Meanwhile, the story of Aslan's journey continued to capture hearts across the nation. News outlets covered his release, framing it as a victory for animal rights and a testament to the power of perseverance. Mark, however, remained a source of tension. He had distanced himself further from Linda and Sarah, his resentment festering in silence. One evening, as Linda was preparing dinner, Mark unexpectedly showed up at the door. "What do you want, Mark?" Linda asked, her tone wary. He hesitated, his gaze shifting awkwardly. "I heard about the sanctuary," he said finally. "You really think this is the right thing for her?" Linda bristled. "Yes, I do. Sarah deserves to see the lion who saved her. And Aslan deserves to know he hasn't been forgotten." Mark's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained cautious. "Just be careful, Linda. You're putting a lot of hope in an animal. Don't let her get hurt again." Linda's anger flared, but she held her tongue. Instead, she simply said, "Sarah will be fine. She's stronger than you give her credit for." The day of the visit finally arrived, and Sarah could barely contain her excitement as they drove to the sanctuary. She clutched a folder filled with her drawings, chattering non-stop about what she would say to Aslan. When they arrived, Grace greeted them warmly at the gates. "You must be Sarah," she said with a smile. Sarah nodded eagerly. "Is Aslan here? Can I see him?" Grace chuckled. "He's waiting for you. Come on." They walked to the enclosure, where Aslan lay under the shade of a tree, his amber eyes half closed in relaxation. But as soon as Sarah's voice rang out, his ears perked, and he lifted his head. "Aslan," Sarah called, running to the edge of the fence. The lion stood slowly, his gaze locking onto the little girl. For a moment, it seemed as if time stood still. Then, with a low rumble that sounded almost like a purr, Aslan approached. "He remembers me," Sarah exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. Linda watched in awe as her daughter and the lion reconnected, their bond stronger than ever despite the years of separation. In that moment, Linda knew they had done the right thing. Aslan was finally free, and Sarah was finally whole. The golden sunlight streamed through the trees, illuminating the sanctuary with a serene glow. Sarah pressed her small hands against the fence of Aslan's enclosure, her wide eyes never leaving the lion who now stood only a few feet away. Aslan's amber gaze met hers, filled with a quiet recognition that brought tears to Linda's eyes. "He remembers you, Sarah," Linda said softly, her voice breaking. Sarah nodded, her lips trembling with emotion. "Hi, Aslan. It's me. I missed you so much." Aslan let out a low rumble, his massive frame lowering to the ground as he lay close to the fence. It was a gesture of trust, one that sent waves of warmth through everyone watching. Grace, the sanctuary's head caretaker, stood nearby, her arms crossed as she observed the interaction. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured to Linda. "It's as if he's been waiting for her all this time." Linda's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They've always had a special bond. Even after everything, it's still there. The visit continued as Sarah eagerly showed Aslan her drawings. She held up each one, her little fingers trembling with excitement. "Look, Aslan, this is us playing at the zoo. And this one is you saving me from the bad guy." Linda winced at the mention of Sarah's accident but said nothing, allowing her daughter to share her joy without interruption. Aslan, for his part, seemed almost mesmerized, his gaze following Sarah's every movement. Grace approached Linda, her tone cautious but warm. "I don't want to overstep, but would you like Sarah to come inside the enclosure?" "Under supervision, of course." Linda's breath caught. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. "You think it's safe?" Grace nodded. "I've worked with animals my whole life, and I've never seen one so calm around a child. I wouldn't suggest it if I wasn't confident." Linda turned to Sarah, who was looking at her expectantly. "What do you think, sweetheart? Do you want to see Aslan up close?" "Yes," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. With Grace's guidance, they entered a smaller, secure area within the enclosure. Aslan remained still as Sarah approached, his eyes soft and unwavering. "Hi, Aslan," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Aslan leaned forward slightly, his massive head lowering as if to greet her. Sarah reached out tentatively, her tiny hand brushing against his mane. Linda held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed. But Aslan didn't move. He stayed perfectly still, his presence calm and reassuring. "You're so soft," Sarah giggled, her fear melting into delight. Linda felt tears stream down her face as she watched her daughter and the lion reconnect in a way that seemed almost magical. For the first time in years, the weight of guilt and grief lifted from her shoulders, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Later, as they sat in a shaded picnic area, Grace joined Linda for a quiet conversation. "You're incredibly brave," Grace said, sipping from a cup of iced tea. "Most people would have given up long before now." Linda shook her head. "It wasn't bravery. It was guilt. I let them take him away. I let him suffer because I was too scared to stand up to Mark." Grace placed a comforting hand on Linda's. "But you made it right. You fought for him and now he's here. That's what matters." Linda nodded, though her thoughts drifted to Mark. He had refused to come to the sanctuary, claiming he had no interest in reliving the past, but Linda suspected his absence had more to do with guilt than apathy. "Do you think Aslan will be okay here?" Linda asked, changing the subject. Grace smiled. "He'll thrive. He's already starting to recover, and with time, he'll be as strong as he was before. You gave him that chance." Linda's heart swelled with relief. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that things might truly get better. That evening, as they prepared to leave, Sarah turned to Aslan one last time. "I'll come back, okay? I'll visit you all the time." Aslan let out a soft rumble, his eyes following her as she walked away. In the car, Sarah was quiet, her head resting against the window as she clutched her stuffed lion. "Mommy," she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Aslan missed me as much as I missed him?" Linda smiled, her voice warm with certainty. "I know he did, baby. I know he did." When they arrived home, the house felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of the past 3 years had finally begun to lift. Linda tucked Sarah into bed, kissing her forehead as she whispered, "Sweet dreams, my love." But as Linda walked back to her room, her thoughts drifted to Mark. His absence at the sanctuary and his continued hostility toward Aslan gnawed at her. She knew they couldn't keep avoiding the conversation forever. The door creaked open, and Linda found Mark sitting in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "How was it?" he asked without looking up. "It was beautiful," Linda said simply. "You should have been there." Mark scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I didn't need to be." "Yes, you did," Linda said, her voice firm. "You've spent 3 years blaming Aslan for what happened, but you never saw the truth. You never saw how much he loved her." Mark's jaw tightened. "I saw what I needed to see. He's a wild animal, Linda. He doesn't love." Linda stepped closer, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're wrong. He saved her, Mark. He protected her when we couldn't. And now she's awake, and she remembers him. How can you deny that?" Mark's eyes finally met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or pain. But then he looked away, his walls firmly back in place. I'm glad she's happy, he said quietly. But I'm not going to pretend that lion didn't change everything. Linda's shoulders sagged, but she refused to give up. Maybe he did change everything, but not the way you think. He brought her back to us, Mark. Isn't that worth forgiving? Mark didn't answer, and Linda left him alone with his thoughts. In the sanctuary, Aslan lay under the stars, his massive frame rising and falling with each steady breath. He was free now, surrounded by peace and safety, but his thoughts lingered on the little girl who had visited him earlier. With a low, contented rumble, he closed his eyes, the bond between him and Sarah unbroken even by the years of pain and distance. The days after their visit to the sanctuary brought a rare calm to Linda and Sarah's lives. For the first time in years, there was a sense of peace, a feeling that the worst might finally be behind them. Yet, beneath that peace lingered unfinished business. Mark's refusal to reconcile with the truth about Aslan. It was a bright Sunday morning when Linda decided it was time to confront her husband. Mark had spent the past few days holed up in his workshop, tinkering with projects he rarely finished, avoiding conversation like a man fleeing from ghosts. Sarah, busy in the living room drawing yet another picture of Aslan, hummed softly to herself. The sight filled Linda with determination. Her daughter had found her light again, but their family wouldn't truly heal until Mark faced his demons. She found him in the garage, hunched over a wooden table, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and varnish. "Mark, we need to talk," Linda said, leaning against the doorway. He didn't look up. "If this is about Aslan, I don't want to hear it. It's always about Aslan, isn't it?" Linda snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "But it's not really about him, Mark. It's about you. You're angry, but not at him. You're angry at yourself." Mark's hands froze mid-motion, his knuckles white against the hammer he was holding. "I'm not doing this, Linda." "Yes, you are," she insisted, stepping closer. "I'm done tiptoeing around your anger, pretending it's fine that you haven't been a father to Sarah since the accident. She's awake now, Mark. She needs you, and whether you like it or not, she needs Aslan too." Mark slammed the hammer down, the sharp sound echoing in the small space. "You don't get it, do you? I was trying to protect her. I did what I thought was right. By lying?" Linda shot back, her voice trembling with fury. "By condemning an innocent animal to years of suffering? That wasn't protecting her, Mark. That was protecting yourself from the guilt, from the truth. But it didn't work, did it? Because here we are, and you're still carrying it all." Mark's chest heaved as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we'd lose her, and when the doctor said she might never wake up, I couldn't take it. Blaming the lion was easier than blaming myself." Linda's anger softened into sadness. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "Mark, you're not the only one who felt that way. I blamed myself too, every single day. But we can't keep punishing ourselves or each other for what happened. Sarah's awake now. She's happy, and she wants us to be happy too." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "Do you really think she's better off with that lion in her life?" "I know she is," Linda said firmly, "and so are we. He's not just a lion, Mark. He's family." Later that evening, Mark surprised Linda and Sarah by joining them for dinner. It was the first time in months that they had sat together as a family, and though the air was still tinged with unspoken tension, it was a start. Sarah beamed at her father, her face lighting up with the pure joy only a child could feel. "Daddy, do you want to see my new drawing of Aslan?" Mark hesitated, glancing at Linda, who gave him a subtle nod. "Sure, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sarah ran to fetch her drawing, returning moments later with a colorful picture of herself and Aslan playing under a bright blue sky. "That's beautiful, Sarah," Mark said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Do you think he misses me?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Mark looked at the drawing for a long moment before answering. "I think he does, and I think he's really lucky to have you in his life." The next morning, Linda received an unexpected call from Grace at the sanctuary. "Hi, Linda," Grace said, her tone warm but urgent. "I wanted to give you a heads up. Aslan's story has gained a lot of attention, and we're hosting an open day at the sanctuary to educate people about his journey. I thought you and Sarah might like to be there." Linda's heart skipped a beat. "That sounds wonderful. Sarah would love it." And Grace hesitated. "It might be good for your husband, too. Seeing Aslan in this environment, seeing how far he's come, it could help." Linda considered this, her mind racing. "I'll talk to him," she said finally. Convincing Mark to attend the event was no small feat. He resisted at first, his old defenses rising as he argued that it wasn't necessary. But Linda's quiet persistence, combined with Sarah's pleading eyes, eventually wore him down. "Fine," he said grudgingly. "But don't expect me to change my mind about anything." The day of the open event arrived, and the sanctuary buzzed with activity. Families wandered between enclosures, children's laughter mixing with the sounds of animals in the distance. Linda and Sarah made their way to Aslan's enclosure, where a small crowd had gathered to hear Grace speak. "This is Aslan," Grace began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "He's not just a survivor. He's a symbol of resilience and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals." Aslan lay in the shade, his eyes half closed as he listened to the familiar voice. But when Sarah called out, "Hi, Aslan," his ears perked, and he lifted his head. The crowd gasped as the lion rose and walked toward the fence, his movements deliberate and calm. Sarah pressed her hands against the fence, her face glowing with joy. "He remembers me," she exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder. Linda glanced at Mark, who stood stiffly beside her. His eyes were locked on Aslan, his expression unreadable. "What do you see, Mark?" Linda asked quietly. Mark didn't respond for a long time. Finally, he said, "I see a lion who loves my daughter." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "And that's all he's ever been." Mark exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of pent-up guilt and anger. He crouched beside Sarah, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're right, sweetheart. He does remember you, and I think he always will." That evening, as they drove home, the air in the car was lighter, the tension that had weighed them down for years finally beginning to lift. Sarah fell asleep in the back seat, clutching her stuffed lion, her face peaceful. Linda reached over and took Mark's hand, her voice soft. "Thank you for coming today." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for not giving up on me." For the first time in years, Linda felt like their family was whole again. And as the car rolled through the quiet streets of their town, she couldn't help but think that Aslan had brought them back together in more ways than one. The house was filled with a rare and delicate sense of calm. For the first time in years, Linda felt as though the pieces of her fractured family were beginning to come together. The memory of Mark crouching by the sanctuary fence, acknowledging Aslan's bond with Sarah, played in her mind like a song she didn't want to forget. But beneath that fragile peace lingered a quiet uncertainty. Linda knew Mark's acceptance of Aslan wasn't complete. It was a crack in the wall, not the collapse of it. She also knew that with the growing media attention surrounding Aslan's story, more challenges were sure to come. The morning began with the usual flurry of Sarah's excitement. She was buzzing around the kitchen, chattering about her plans to draw more pictures for Aslan and wondering aloud what he might like to eat if he ever visited their home. "Do you think he'd like peanut butter sandwiches, Mommy?" she asked, her face scrunched in thought. Linda laughed softly. "I think lions prefer something a little meatier, sweetheart." Sarah giggled, her joy infectious. "Well, maybe we can make him some anyway, just in case." Mark entered the kitchen, his steps slower than usual. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, watching Sarah with a faint smile. "You're up early," Linda said, placing a plate of toast in front of him. Mark nodded, his gaze distant. "Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about yesterday." Linda sat down across from him, her voice gentle. "It was a lot to take in, wasn't it?" Mark looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I've spent 3 years telling myself that Lion was the reason for everything that went wrong. Seeing him yesterday, I don't know, felt different. Linda reached out and placed her hand over his. Because deep down, you know he's not the villain in this story. He's the hero, Mark. He saved her. Mark didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. As the day went on, Linda received an email from Grace at the sanctuary. The subject line read, "Urgent, media attention on Aslan." Linda's stomach tightened as she opened the email. "Hi Linda, I wanted to give you a heads up. Aslan's story has gone viral, and while most of the attention is positive, there's been some pushback from groups claiming that his bond with Sarah is fabricated or exaggerated. They're questioning whether his release from Oakwood was justified. We're handling the inquiries as best we can, but I thought you should know. Best, Grace." Linda stared at the screen, her heart sinking. Despite all they had done to prove Aslan's innocence, there were still people who wanted to tear him down. "What's wrong, Mom?" Sarah asked, peeking over Linda's shoulder. Linda quickly closed the laptop. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Why don't you go work on your drawings?" Sarah frowned but nodded, skipping off to the living room. Mark walked in, his brow furrowing when he saw Linda's expression. "What happened?" Linda handed him the phone, letting him read the email for himself. His jaw tightened as he finished. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice low. "After everything that Lion's been through, they're still coming after him?" Linda nodded, her voice heavy with frustration. "I thought we were past this, Mark. But it seems like the world always needs someone to blame." Mark set the phone down, his eyes narrowing. "What are you going to do about it?" Linda took a deep breath. "I'm going to fight back. For Aslan, for Sarah, and for us." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Linda worked with Grace to organize a press conference at the sanctuary, where she planned to share Aslan's story in full. She wanted the world to see the truth, the bond between Sarah and Aslan, the sacrifices he had made, and the redemption he deserved. Mark surprised Linda by offering to help. He spent hours reading through articles and gathering supportive comments from the public to counter the negative narratives. Though he still struggled with his feelings about Aslan, his actions spoke louder than his words. The day of the press conference arrived, and Linda stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she faced a crowd of reporters and cameras. Behind her, Grace and the sanctuary staff stood in solidarity, with Sarah sitting front and center, her stuffed lion in her lap. "Thank you all for being here," Linda began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm here to tell you the story of a lion named Aslan. A story of resilience, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between a little girl and an animal who saved her life." Linda recounted the events leading up to Sarah's accident, her voice breaking as she described Aslan's protective actions. She spoke of his years at Oakwood, the cruelty he endured, and the fight to bring him to the sanctuary. "But Aslan's story is not just about survival," Linda continued. "It's about forgiveness. It's about the capacity for love and connection that transcends species. Aslan didn't just save my daughter. He saved our family." As she finished, Linda stepped aside, motioning for Sarah to come forward. "This is Sarah," Linda said, her voice filled with pride. "And she'd like to say something to Aslan." Sarah approached the microphone, her small hands clutching her stuffed lion. "Hi, Aslan," she said, her voice echoing across the sanctuary. "I just wanted to say thank you. You're my best friend, and I love you." The crowd erupted in applause, tears glistening in the eyes of many onlookers. Later, as they walked back to Aslan's enclosure, Linda felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had shared their story with the world, and for the first time she felt like they had truly been heard. Mark walked beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You were amazing out there," he said quietly. Linda smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." They reached the fence, where Aslan lay basking in the sun. He lifted his head as Sarah approached, letting out a low, contented rumble. "See, Mommy?" Sarah said, grinning. "He knows we're here." Linda knelt beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Yes, he does, sweetheart, and he always will." Mark joined them, crouching beside Sarah. For the first time, he reached out and placed his hand against the fence. his gaze meeting Aslan's. "I'm sorry," Mark said softly, his voice trembling. "For everything." Aslan let out another rumble, as if accepting the apology. In that moment, Linda knew their family had finally begun to heal. The atmosphere at the sanctuary was vibrant and hopeful. But for Linda, the true victory was the moment she witnessed Mark silently apologizing to Aslan. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. But that small gesture spoke volumes, and it signaled a shift she hadn't thought possible. The days following the press conference brought a whirlwind of attention. News outlets aired segments highlighting Aslan's story, and Linda's inbox was flooded with messages of support. Families shared their own stories of animals who had changed their lives. Activists offered encouragement, and even strangers expressed gratitude for Linda's bravery in fighting for Aslan. But not everyone was pleased. One evening, as Linda was tucking Sarah into bed, her phone buzzed with a notification. She kissed Sarah's forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, my love," before heading to the kitchen to check the message. The email was short but chilling. "Stay out of the spotlight, or there will be consequences." Her hands trembled as she read the words again. No sender's name, no details, just a vague but unmistakable threat. Mark walked into the kitchen, stopping in his tracks when he saw her pale face. "What's wrong?" he asked. Linda handed him the phone, unable to speak. Mark's jaw clenched as he read the email, his fists tightening at his sides. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice low but laced with anger. "They're trying to intimidate you." Linda nodded, swallowing hard. "I won't let them scare me, Mark. Aslan deserves justice, and I'm not going to stop just because someone's trying to silence me." Mark's expression softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this anymore, Linda. We'll face them together." The following day, Linda reported the threat to the local authorities. While the police promised to investigate, their words were cautious and non-committal. "These kinds of messages are often empty," the officer said, "but it's always good to stay vigilant. Don't hesitate to call us if you notice anything suspicious." Linda left the station feeling a mix of relief and unease. The officer's reassurance hadn't completely erased her fear, but she refused to let it deter her. Back at the sanctuary, Grace and her team were dealing with their own challenges. The influx of visitors and media attention had drawn scrutiny from groups skeptical of Aslan's story. Representatives from Oakwood Wildlife Center had issued statements claiming that Linda's narrative was emotionally exaggerated and that Aslan had been humanized to garner public sympathy. "They're trying to discredit us," Grace told Linda during a phone call. "But we're not backing down. We have the truth on our side." Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. How can people still doubt this? Sarah's connection with Aslan isn't something you can fake. "They're desperate," Grace said. "They know they're losing, and this is their last-ditch effort to save face. Stay strong, Linda. We'll get through this." Later that week, Linda decided it was time to bring Sarah back to the sanctuary for another visit. She wanted to remind herself and her daughter of the joy that had come from their fight for Aslan. Mark agreed to join them, though his usual gruffness remained. As they drove to the sanctuary, Sarah chatted excitedly about seeing Aslan again. "Do you think he'll remember my new drawings, Daddy?" she asked, holding up a colorful picture of herself and Aslan playing in a field of flowers. "I'm sure he will," Mark said, his tone softer than usual. When they arrived, Grace greeted them warmly. "It's good to see you again," she said, crouching down to Sarah's level. "Aslan's been doing great. He's more active, eating well, and starting to regain his strength." Sarah beamed. "Can we see him now?" Grace laughed. "Of course. Come on." They made their way to Aslan's enclosure, where the lion lay in the shade, his massive frame relaxed but alert. At the sound of Sarah's voice, he lifted his head, his ears perking up. "Aslan," Sarah called, running to the fence. The lion stood slowly, his amber eyes locking onto hers. He let out a deep, rumbling purr as he approached, stopping just a few feet from the fence. "He remembers me," Sarah exclaimed, her face glowing with joy. Mark watched the interaction in silence, his expression unreadable. But Linda noticed the way his posture softened, the way his gaze lingered on the lion with something almost like respect. As the visit continued, Grace invited the family to participate in a new enrichment activity for Aslan. "We've set up a puzzle feeder in his enclosure," she explained. "It's designed to engage his natural instincts and encourage problem-solving. Would you like to help?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Yes, please." Linda and Mark joined her as they helped Grace prepare the feeder, filling it with meat and hiding it within a large, sturdy structure that would require Aslan to use his strength and intelligence to access the reward. When the feeder was placed in the enclosure, Aslan approached cautiously, sniffing at the structure before using his massive paws to manipulate it. The sight was mesmerizing, a reminder of the lion's power and intelligence. "He's incredible," Mark muttered, almost to himself. Linda glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "He always has been." As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned to Grace with a question. "Can Aslan come home with us someday?" Grace crouched down beside her, her expression gentle. "Aslan's home is here now, where he has the space and freedom he needs. But you can visit him anytime you want. And I know he'll always be happy to see you." Sarah nodded, her disappointment fading into understanding. "Okay, but I'll still miss him." Grace smiled. "And he'll miss you, too." That evening, as they drove home, Linda felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. Mark sat beside her, quiet but thoughtful, while Sarah dozed peacefully in the back seat. "Thank you for coming today," Linda said, breaking the silence. Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the road. I think I finally get it. He's more than just a lion, isn't he?" Linda's voice was soft but firm. "He's family, Mark. He always has been." Mark exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing. "Maybe it's time I started treating him like it." That night, as Linda lay in bed, her thoughts drifted to Aslan. She pictured him lying under the stars at the sanctuary, free and safe at last. And for the first time, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The soft rhythm of rain tapped against the windows as Linda stared at her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had been drafting a letter to the editor of a major newspaper, hoping to counter Oakwood Wildlife Center's latest attempts to tarnish Aslan's story. Yet the words wouldn't come. Down the hall, Sarah's laughter rang out as she played with her stuffed lion. The sound was a comforting reminder of why Linda had fought so hard, but the weight of the ongoing battle against Oakwood felt heavier with each passing day. Mark entered the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He placed one beside Linda and leaned against the desk, studying her tired face. "Still fighting the good fight?" he asked, his tone lighter than she expected. Linda sighed, running a hand through her hair. "They're relentless, Mark. They're calling Aslan's bond with Sarah a fabrication. They're trying to make it seem like we manipulated the public for sympathy." Mark frowned, his jaw tightening. "That's ridiculous. Anyone who sees Sarah with that lion knows it's real." Linda glanced up at him, surprised by his conviction. "You've come a long way from calling him a dangerous wild animal." Mark smirked, though his eyes betrayed his seriousness. "Yeah, well, people change." The next day, Linda received an unexpected phone call from Grace. Her voice was calm but tinged with urgency. "Linda, there's been an incident at the sanctuary," Grace said. "Nothing serious, but Aslan's enclosure was tampered with last night. Someone cut the perimeter fence." Linda's heart raced. "Is he okay?" "He's fine," Grace reassured her. "We discovered it before anything could happen, and Aslan is secure. But this wasn't random. Someone wanted to make it look like he was dangerous or trying to escape." Linda felt a cold wave of anger wash over her. "You think it's Oakwood?" "We can't say for sure, but it wouldn't be surprising," Grace replied. "We filed a report with the authorities, but I thought you should know." Linda thanked her and hung up, her mind racing. It was clear that Oakwood was escalating their tactics, and Linda knew she couldn't afford to stay quiet. That evening, Linda gathered her family in the living room. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, her stuffed lion in her lap, while Mark leaned against the arm of the couch, his arms crossed. "We need to talk," Linda began, her voice steady. Someone tampered with Aslan's enclosure last night. Grace thinks it might have been an attempt to discredit him, or us. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. Did they hurt him? No, sweetheart, Linda said quickly, kneeling beside her. He's okay, but this means we have to be extra careful. Some people don't want Aslan to have a happy ending, and we need to make sure they don't win. Mark nodded, his expression serious. What do you need from me? Linda hesitated, surprised by his offer. I was planning to reach out to the media again, maybe do an interview to set the record straight. But if you're willing, your voice could make a difference. Mark looked uncertain, his gaze flicking to Sarah before returning to Linda. You really think anyone wants to hear what I have to say? I do, Linda said firmly. You've seen both sides of this. People will listen to you, Mark. After a long pause, he nodded. Okay, let's do it. The following week, Linda and Mark appeared on a popular morning show, their segment titled A Lion's Redemption. The family behind Aslan's story, the set was bright and inviting, but the tension between them was palpable as they sat side by side under the studio lights. The host, a charismatic woman named Diane, smiled warmly as she introduced them. Today, we're joined by Linda and Mark Carter, the family whose incredible journey with a lion named Aslan has captured the hearts of millions. Thank you both for being here. Thank you for having us, Linda said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Diane turned to Mark. Mr. Carter, I understand you were initially opposed to Aslan's release from Oakwood. Can you tell us what changed? Mark hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I was scared, he admitted. After Sarah's accident, I blamed Aslan because it was easier than facing my own guilt. I thought keeping him away would keep us safe. But seeing him at the sanctuary, seeing how much he means to Sarah, it opened my eyes. Aslan didn't hurt our family. He saved it. Linda's chest tightened with emotion as she listened to his words. For so long, she had carried the burden of fighting alone. Hearing Mark speak the truth was a validation she hadn't realized she needed. Diane leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. And Sarah? How does she feel about Aslan now? Linda smiled. She loves him more than ever. He's her best friend. Their bond is something I can't fully explain, but it's real. It's powerful. The segment ended with a montage of footage from the sanctuary, including clips of Sarah interacting with Aslan. The audience applauded, and Diane closed with a heartfelt statement. Aslan's story reminds us of the resilience of animals and the unbreakable bonds we can share with them. Thank you, Linda and Mark, for sharing your journey with us. Back at home, Sarah bounced with excitement as she watched the recorded segment on TV. Daddy, you were so brave, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Mark. Mark chuckled, ruffling her hair. Thanks, kiddo. But your mom's the real hero. Linda smiled, her heart full as she watched her family begin to heal. But the peace didn't last long. A few nights later, Linda woke to the sound of a car idling outside. She peered through the curtains to see a dark sedan parked across the street, its headlights off but its engine running. Her stomach churned with unease as she watched the car sit there for what felt like hours. Finally, it drove away, but the lingering sense of being watched stayed with her. When she told Mark about it the next morning, his reaction was immediate. We're installing cameras, he said firmly. If they're gonna play dirty, we'll be ready. Linda nodded, her resolve hardening. They had come too far to back down now. That evening, as the rain fell softly against the windows, Linda sat with Sarah, who was drawing yet another picture of Aslan. This time, she had added their whole family, including Mark, standing beside the lion. Do you think Daddy and Aslan will be friends someday? Sarah asked, her voice filled with hope. Linda smiled, her hand brushing against Sarah's hair. I think they already are, sweetheart. They just don't know it yet. As Sarah continued coloring, Linda felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their family was stronger together, and they would face whatever came next with courage and love. The rhythmic hum of a vacuum cleaner buzzed faintly in the background as Linda sat at the kitchen table, poring over legal documents and emails from Grace. Though her family had made significant progress in their healing, the battle over Aslan's reputation had only intensified. Oakwood Wildlife Center had released a damning public statement, accusing Linda of fabricating key details about Aslan's history and implying that her efforts were nothing more than a publicity stunt. Linda sighed, her frustration mounting. For every step forward, it seemed as though Oakwood dragged them 2 steps back. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Sarah's voice cut through her thoughts. She stood in the doorway clutching her stuffed lion, her bright eyes full of concern. Linda forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's face. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just some boring grown-up stuff." Sarah frowned, unconvinced. "Is it about Aslan?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but don't worry. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Sarah smiled, her trust in her mother absolute. "Aslan's the best lion in the whole world. No one can say he isn't." Linda hugged her tightly, her determination renewed by her daughter's unwavering faith. Meanwhile, Mark was in the garage, installing security cameras around the perimeter of their home. The car that had idled outside their house a few nights earlier still haunted him, and he refused to take any chances. As he tightened the final screw, Linda stepped into the garage. "Thanks for doing this," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Mark wiped his hands on a rag, his expression serious. "We can't let them intimidate us. If they want to fight, we'll give them one." Linda nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You're starting to sound like me." Mark chuckled, but his tone turned somber. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the sanctuary, that Aslan saved our family. I didn't want to believe it at first, but you were right. He did. And I think it's time I started doing my part." Linda's heart swelled with gratitude. "You already have, Mark. Just being here, supporting Sarah. It means more than you know." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let's just make sure Oakwood doesn't get the last word." A week later, Grace called with an update that left Linda reeling. "Linda, we've uncovered something big," Grace said, her voice brimming with urgency. "One of our volunteers used to work at Oakwood, and they've provided documents showing years of neglect and abuse at the facility. It's worse than we thought." Linda's stomach turned. "What kind of documents?" "Internal memos, inspection reports, even emails between staff admitting to falsifying records. Oakwood has been covering up violations for years," Grace explained. "And it's not just Aslan. Dozens of animals suffered because of their negligence." Linda's grip on the phone tightened. "This could change everything." "It could," Grace agreed. "But we need to act fast. If Oakwood gets wind of this, they'll destroy the evidence. We're organizing a press conference to release everything. Can you be there?" "Of course," Linda said without hesitation. "I wouldn't miss it." The night before the press conference, Linda couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room with a cup of tea, staring out the window as the wind rustled the trees. Mark joined her, his footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. Linda shook her head. "There's too much at stake. This could finally be the breakthrough we need, but it's risky. If Oakwood retaliates..." Mark placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You're not alone in this anymore, Linda. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Linda looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mark, for everything." The next morning, the sanctuary was abuzz with activity as reporters, activists, and supporters gathered for the press conference. Linda, Mark, and Sarah arrived early, greeted by Grace and her team. "Are you ready?" Grace asked, handing Linda a copy of the evidence they were about to present. "As ready as I'll ever be," Linda replied, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. Sarah tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, can I say hi to Aslan before we start?" Grace smiled. "He's in his enclosure." "Go ahead, Sarah. He'll be happy to see you." Sarah beamed, running off with a staff member to visit Aslan. The press conference began with Grace addressing the crowd, her voice firm and resolute as she detailed Oakwood's history of abuse and neglect. She then introduced Linda, who took the podium to share her personal story. "Aslan is more than a lion," Linda began, her voice filled with emotion. He's a symbol of resilience, of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. But his story is just one of many. For years, Oakwood Wildlife Center has subjected countless animals to conditions no living being should endure. Today, we're here to demand accountability. Linda presented the evidence, her words punctuated by gasps from the audience as each damning document was revealed. Mark stepped forward next, his voice strong as he admitted his own role in Aslan's journey. "I made mistakes," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I let fear cloud my judgment, and I blamed an innocent animal for things he didn't do. But I'm here today because I've seen the truth. Aslan didn't just survive. He taught us what it means to be brave." The crowd erupted in applause, their support palpable. As the press conference concluded, Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had done everything they could to expose the truth, and now the world knew the extent of Oakwood's cruelty. Back at Aslan's enclosure, Sarah sat by the fence, chatting with the lion as if no time had passed since their last visit. "I told you we'd help you, Aslan," she said, her voice full of pride. "And now everyone knows how amazing you are." Aslan let out a low rumble, his amber eyes soft as he watched the little girl who had always believed in him. Linda and Mark joined Sarah, their hearts full as they watched the bond between their daughter and the lion that had changed their lives. For the first time in years, Linda felt a sense of peace. They had faced the darkness, and together, they had found the light. The drive back home from the sanctuary was quiet. Sarah had fallen asleep in the back seat, clutching her stuffed lion as a soft smile played on her lips. Linda glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, feeling an overwhelming mix of exhaustion and hope. Mark sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Every so often, he would glance at Linda, as though searching for the right words to say. "You did good today," he finally said, breaking the silence. Linda gave him a small smile. "We all did. It feels like we're finally turning the tide." Mark nodded but didn't respond. He looked lost in thought, as though there was more he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to. The next morning, Linda was greeted by a flood of notifications on her phone. The press conference had gone viral, with articles, videos, and hashtags spreading like wildfire across social media. Public support for Aslan had surged, and calls to shut down Oakwood Wildlife Center were growing louder. As Linda scrolled through the messages, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a courier holding a thick envelope. "Delivery for Linda Carter," the man said, handing her the package before walking away. Linda closed the door and stared at the envelope, her heart racing. The return address was from a law firm representing Oakwood. Mark walked into the room, a mug of coffee in his hand. "What's that?" Linda hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a letter outlining a lawsuit against her for defamation, along with a demand to cease all public comments about Aslan and Oakwood. "They're suing me," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark took the letter from her, his eyes scanning the contents. "This is a scare tactic," he said firmly. "They know they're losing, so they're trying to intimidate you into silence." Linda sank into a chair, her hands trembling. What if it works? What if they take everything we've fought for and twist it into something ugly? Mark crouched in front of her, his expression resolute. "It won't work. You have the truth on your side, Linda, and you're not alone in this. We'll fight them together." The next few days were a blur of meetings with lawyers and strategy sessions with Grace and her team. The lawsuit was baseless, but it was still a heavy burden, draining Linda's energy and resources. Amid the chaos, Sarah remained a beacon of light. She spent her afternoons drawing pictures of Aslan and talking about the day they would bring him home for a visit. "Mommy, do you think Aslan misses us?" she asked one evening as Linda tucked her into bed. "I think he misses you most of all," Linda said with a smile. Sarah nodded, her voice soft. "I miss him too, but I know he's happy now." "You made him happy, Mommy." Linda kissed her forehead, her heart swelling with love and determination. "Good night, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." The following week, Linda received a surprising phone call from a major news outlet. They wanted to feature her story in an exclusive documentary about Aslan's journey and the fight to shut down Oakwood. It's a big opportunity, Grace said when Linda told her the news. If we can get the public even more engaged, Oakwood won't stand a chance. Linda agreed, though she couldn't shake the fear of what might happen next. Filming for the documentary began at the sanctuary, where the crew captured footage of Aslan in his enclosure and interviewed Linda, Sarah, and Grace. Mark, who had initially been reluctant, eventually agreed to participate, sharing his perspective on how Aslan had changed their lives. I didn't always believe in him, Mark admitted during his interview. But seeing what he's done for my daughter, for my family, I can't deny it anymore. Aslan is more than a lion. He's a miracle. The crew also filmed Sarah interacting with Aslan, capturing the tender moments that had come to define their bond. "Hi, Aslan," Sarah said, holding up another one of her drawings. "Look, I made this for you. It's me and you playing in a field of flowers." Aslan let out a soft rumble, his amber eyes fixed on the little girl. It was a moment of pure connection, one that left the crew visibly moved. As the documentary gained momentum, public pressure on Oakwood intensified. Protests outside the facility grew larger, and several former employees came forward with their own accounts of neglect and abuse. But Oakwood didn't back down. They doubled down on their smear campaign, accusing Linda of exploiting her daughter's story for fame and profit. One night, as Linda was preparing for bed, her phone buzzed with a call from Grace. "Linda, I just got word that Oakwood is planning to file an emergency injunction to stop the documentary from airing," Grace said, her voice tense. Linda's stomach sank. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Grace replied. "But they'd need solid grounds, and they don't have any. Still, we need to be prepared." The next morning, Linda met with her legal team to discuss their options. The lawyers assured her that the injunction was unlikely to succeed, but the constant battles were taking their toll. Mark noticed the strain and took her hands in his. "We're almost there, Linda. Don't let them break you now." Linda nodded, drawing strength from his support. "I won't. Not when we're this close." The day of the documentary's premiere arrived, and Linda's family gathered in the living room to watch. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, her stuffed lion in her lap, while Mark and Linda sat side by side on the couch. As the opening scenes played, Linda felt a mix of anxiety and pride. The footage was raw and emotional, capturing the highs and lows of their journey. When the credits rolled, Sarah turned to her parents, her eyes shining with excitement. "Do you think Aslan saw it too?" Mark chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Maybe, and I bet he's proud of you." That night, as Linda lay in bed, her phone buzzed with another notification. She hesitated before checking it, half expecting another threat or insult. Instead, it was a message from Grace. "The documentary is trending worldwide. Oakwood just issued a statement retracting their lawsuit. We did it, Linda. We won." Tears streamed down Linda's face as she read the words. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of closure. They had fought for Aslan and they had won. The news of Oakwood Wildlife Center retracting their lawsuit spread like wildfire. Linda's phone buzzed incessantly with messages of congratulations, support, and gratitude. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to exhale, the weight of the fight finally lifting from her shoulders. That morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Sarah bounded into the kitchen, her face glowing with excitement. "Mommy, did you see? Everyone's talking about Aslan," she exclaimed, waving Linda's phone, which she had snuck off the counter. Linda chuckled, taking the phone back gently. "I did, sweetheart. It's amazing, isn't it?" Sarah nodded vigorously. "Does this mean we can see Aslan more now?" Linda paused, her heart warming at her daughter's innocence. "It means Aslan's story has helped so many people, Sarah. And yes, we'll visit him again soon." Mark entered the kitchen, his expression lighter than Linda had seen in months. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "I have to admit," he said, looking at Linda, "I didn't think we'd actually win." Linda smirked, stirring her tea. "That's because you underestimated us." Mark laughed softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess I did. The victory didn't mean the work was over." Grace called Linda that afternoon to discuss the next steps. With Oakwood's reputation in ruins, there's a real possibility they'll shut down, Grace said. But we need to ensure that the animals still in their care are relocated to safe sanctuaries. Linda nodded, pacing her living room. What can I do to help? We're organizing a task force to monitor the transition. Your voice would carry a lot of weight, Grace explained. If you're willing, we could use you as a spokesperson. Linda hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who was busy drawing another picture of Aslan. Part of her wanted to step back, to reclaim the peace she and her family had fought so hard for. But another part of her knew this was an opportunity to make lasting change. I'll do it, Linda said, her voice resolute. For the animals, the following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Linda traveled to Oakwood with Grace and a team of volunteers to oversee the relocation of the remaining animals. The facility, once a symbol of cruelty and neglect, was now a quiet, desolate place. As Linda walked through the empty corridors, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. So many lives had been lost here, both animal and human. It's strange, isn't it? Grace said, joining her. Standing here, knowing this chapter is finally closing, Linda nodded, her voice soft. It's bittersweet, but at least now, these animals will have a chance at a better life. Among the animals being relocated was a timid tiger named Raja, whose haunted eyes reminded Linda of Aslan when they first visited him at the sanctuary. Where's he going? Linda asked, watching as Raja was loaded into a secure transport crate. To a sanctuary in Colorado, Grace replied. It's one of the best in the country. He'll be safe there. Linda nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. Back at home, Sarah was bursting with excitement as Linda shared stories about the animals she had helped relocate. Can we visit Raja someday, too? Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Maybe, Linda said with a smile. But for now, we'll focus on spending more time with Aslan. Sarah grinned, holding up yet another drawing. I made this for him. Do you think he'll like it? Linda examined the picture, which featured Aslan wearing a crown. I think he'll love it. After all, he is the king of the sanctuary. The first visit to Aslan after the victory felt different. The sanctuary was bustling with activity, but there was an air of celebration rather than urgency. Aslan lay in his enclosure, basking in the sun, his golden mane shimmering in the light. When Sarah called out to him, he immediately perked up, letting out a low, contented roar. Hi, Aslan, Sarah exclaimed, running to the fence. Aslan approached slowly, his massive paws leaving impressions in the soft earth. He stopped just a few feet away, his amber eyes locked onto Sarah's. Look, Sarah said, holding up her drawing. It's you, Aslan. You're a king. Linda chuckled as Aslan let out a soft rumble, his tail swishing in approval. Mark stood nearby, watching the interaction with quiet admiration. He looks happy, Mark said, his voice thoughtful. He is, Linda replied, her gaze never leaving Aslan. And so are we. Mark turned to her, his expression earnest. Thank you, Linda, for not giving up. On him, on us. Linda smiled, her heart swelling with love. It was never an option, Mark. Family never gives up. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace at home, Sarah curled up on the couch with her stuffed lion. Mommy, she said sleepily. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Aslan dreams about us? Linda's eyes softened. I think he dreams about all the happy times you've spent together. And I think he knows we'll always be there for him. Sarah nodded, her eyes drifting closed. I hope he knows I love him. Linda kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering, he knows, sweetheart, he knows. As the fire crackled softly, Linda leaned back against the couch, her hand resting on Mark's. The road had been long and difficult, but they had come through it stronger, together. And somewhere under the stars, Aslan lay in his sanctuary, a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a lion and the family he had saved. The cool breeze carried the scent of pine as Linda parked the car outside the sanctuary gates. It had been several weeks since the family's last visit, and Sarah could hardly contain her excitement. She bounced in her seat, clutching a new drawing she had made for Aslan, a colorful picture of them walking together under a rainbow. Are we there yet? Sarah asked for the third time in as many minutes. Linda chuckled. We're here, sweetheart. Just a few more steps and you'll see him. Mark opened the car door, stretching as he stepped out. Though he had grown more comfortable with their visits to Aslan, there was still a lingering hesitation in his movements, a shadow of the doubts and fears he had carried for years. Grace greeted them at the entrance, her smile as warm as the late afternoon sun. Welcome back, she said, crouching down to hug Sarah. I think Aslan's been waiting for you. He's been pacing near the fence all morning. Sarah's eyes lit up. Really? Can we go see him now? Grace laughed. Of course. Come on. Aslan's enclosure was peaceful, the golden light filtering through the trees casting dappled shadows on the ground. When Sarah's voice called out to him, Aslan immediately perked up, his ears swiveling toward the sound. Hi, Aslan, Sarah exclaimed, running to the fence. The lion rose gracefully, his massive frame moving with a quiet power. His amber eyes locked onto Sarah's as he approached, his tail swishing lazily behind him. Sarah pressed her hands against the fence, holding up her drawing. Look, I made this for you. Do you like it? Aslan let out a low rumble, his gaze soft and steady. Mark stood a few feet back, watching the interaction with a mixture of awe and unease. Linda noticed the tension in his posture and gently placed a hand on his arm. You can come closer, you know, she said softly. Mark hesitated, his gaze flickering between Linda and the lion. Finally, he took a step forward, his movements cautious but deliberate. Aslan's eyes shifted to Mark, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two regarded each other in silence, as though weighing the unspoken history between them. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, Aslan lowered his massive head, his mane brushing the ground. He's bowing, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Mark took another step closer, his breath catching in his throat. Is that normal? Grace shook her head, her voice quiet with awe. No, it's not. Mark knelt beside Sarah, his hand resting on the fence. For the first time, he didn't see Aslan as a threat or a reminder of his guilt. He saw him for what he truly was, a protector, a savior, and a member of their family. Thank you, Mark said softly, his voice trembling. For everything. Aslan let out another rumble, his tail swishing once before he settled onto the ground, his gaze never leaving Mark. The rest of the visit was filled with laughter and joy as Sarah shared stories with Aslan and proudly showed him her drawing. Linda watched her daughter, her heart full as she marveled at the resilience and love that had carried them through so much. Grace pulled Linda aside as Sarah played near the fence. There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you, Grace said, her tone serious but kind. Linda's brow furrowed. What is it? We've been reviewing our long-term plans for Aslan's care, Grace explained. He's thriving here, but he's also grown deeply attached to Sarah. We were wondering if you'd be open to helping with his enrichment on a more regular basis. Maybe even becoming a permanent part of his life. Linda's breath caught. You mean bringing him home? Grace shook her head gently. Not quite. He needs the space and safety the sanctuary provides. But we could arrange for special visits, where he comes to you in a controlled environment. It's unconventional, but given his bond with Sarah, it might be worth considering. Linda's heart raced at the thought. The idea of bringing Aslan closer to their family was both thrilling and daunting. I'll need to talk it over with Mark, she said finally. Grace nodded. Of course. Take your time. There's no rush. That evening, back at home, Linda broached the subject with Mark. They sat together on the porch, the cool night air filled with the chirping of crickets. Grace suggested something today, Linda began, her voice careful. Mark raised an eyebrow. What kind of something? She thinks Aslan's bond with Sarah is strong enough to warrant special visits. They'd bring him to us for enrichment activities, under controlled conditions. Mark's expression darkened. You want to bring a lion into our backyard? Not permanently, Linda clarified. It would be supervised. And it could be good for Sarah. And for Aslan. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his gaze distant. I don't know, Linda. It's a big risk. It's also a big opportunity, Linda countered. For our family. For healing. Mark was silent for a long time before finally sighing. Let me think about it. The days that followed were filled with quiet contemplation. Mark spent hours in the garage, working on a project Linda couldn't quite decipher. Sarah, blissfully unaware of the debate, continued drawing pictures of Aslan and dreaming about their next visit. Finally, one evening, Mark approached Linda with a determined look in his eyes. "Let's do it," he said simply. Linda's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Mark nodded. "If it's what's best for Sarah and for Aslan, then we'll make it work." Linda threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Mark. This means everything to me." Mark hugged her tightly, his voice soft. "It's not just for you. It's for all of us." When Linda called Grace to share the news, the sanctuary immediately began making arrangements. The first visit was scheduled for the following month, giving the family time to prepare. Aslan's impending visit brought a mix of excitement and nervousness to the Carter household. Sarah could hardly contain her joy, while Linda and Mark worked together to ensure their home would be safe and welcoming for their extraordinary guest. For the first time in years, their family felt whole, bound together by the love and resilience of a lion who had changed their lives forever. The day of Aslan's first visit arrived with a crisp morning breeze and a palpable sense of anticipation. Linda had spent the past week preparing their backyard, ensuring it was both secure and welcoming for the lion. A reinforced fence had been temporarily installed around the perimeter, and Grace's team had provided detailed instructions for hosting Aslan safely. Sarah woke up early, her excitement bubbling over as she helped Linda set up toys and enrichment items for Aslan's visit. "Do you think he'll like this, Mommy?" Sarah asked, holding up a large, brightly colored ball designed for big cats. Linda smiled. "I think he'll love it, sweetheart. You've put so much thought into everything." Mark stood by the kitchen window, sipping his coffee as he watched them. Though he had agreed to the visit, a flicker of anxiety lingered in his expression. Linda walked over, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's going to be fine," she said softly. Mark nodded, exhaling deeply. "I know. It's just a lion in our backyard. Never thought I'd see the day." Linda chuckled. "Life's full of surprises." The sanctuary's truck pulled into their driveway just before noon, and Sarah ran outside, her face glowing with excitement. Grace stepped out first, greeting the family with her usual warmth. "Are you ready?" Grace asked, crouching down to Sarah's level. "Yes," Sarah exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. Aslan was guided out of the truck by his handlers, his golden mane catching the sunlight. He moved with a calm confidence, his amber eyes scanning his surroundings. When his gaze landed on Sarah, he let out a low, familiar rumble. "He remembers me," Sarah squealed, running to the edge of the secure fence. Linda and Mark followed, their steps more measured as they took in the surreal sight of a lion walking across their backyard. "Aslan's adjusted well to the new environment so far," Grace explained. "He's curious but calm, which is exactly what we want." The afternoon unfolded like a dream. Sarah played with Aslan from her side of the fence, tossing the ball and laughing as the lion batted it back with his massive paws. Mark watched quietly at first, but as the hours passed, he found himself drawn into the moment. "Want to try?" Linda asked, handing him another enrichment toy, a large rope designed for tug-of-war. Mark hesitated, then took the rope, stepping closer to the fence. Aslan eyed him curiously, his tail swishing lazily. "Hey there, big guy," Mark said, his voice steady but cautious. "Let's see what you've got." He tossed the rope over the fence, and Aslan grabbed it with his powerful jaws, pulling with surprising gentleness. Mark laughed despite himself, the tension in his shoulders melting away. "You're stronger than you look," Mark said, his tone lighter than Linda had heard in years. Linda watched the interaction, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time, she felt as though they were truly a family again. As the sun began to set, Grace and her team prepared to guide Aslan back into the transport truck. Sarah clung to the fence, her eyes welling with tears. "Do you have to go already?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grace crouched down beside her, her tone gentle. "Aslan needs to go back to his sanctuary home. But this isn't goodbye. You'll see him again soon, I promise." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "Okay, but I'll miss him." Aslan approached the fence one last time, lowering his massive head to meet Sarah's gaze. She reached through the bars, brushing her fingers against his mane. "I love you, Aslan," she whispered. Aslan let out a soft rumble. His eyes filled with a quiet understanding that left everyone watching in awe. That evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the atmosphere was lighter than it had been in years. Sarah was curled up on the couch with her stuffed lion, recounting every moment of Aslan's visit in vivid detail. "And then he pulled the rope so hard, Daddy almost fell over," Sarah said, giggling. Mark laughed, shaking his head. "He's stronger than I gave him credit for, that's for sure." Linda watched her husband and daughter with a quiet sense of contentment. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. Later that night, as Linda and Mark prepared for bed, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You were right," he said. "About what?" Linda asked, tilting her head. "About everything," Mark admitted. "About Aslan, about what he's done for our family. I didn't want to see it before, but now, I can't ignore it." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Mark. That means more to me than you know." Mark pulled her into a gentle embrace, his voice soft. "We're stronger because of him. All of us." As they lay in bed, Linda stared out the window at the stars, her thoughts drifting to Aslan. She imagined him back at the sanctuary, resting under the same sky, a symbol of resilience, love, and the bond that had brought her family back together. The days following Aslan's visit were filled with a newfound harmony in the Carter household. Mark had softened, his once guarded demeanor giving way to moments of laughter and connection. Sarah, energized by her time with Aslan, seemed to glow with joy as she spoke of him daily, her drawings now adorning nearly every wall in the house. But as life seemed to settle into this new rhythm, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that their journey with Aslan wasn't over. The overwhelming response to the documentary and Oakwood's closure had sparked a wave of change, but it had also stirred darker undercurrents. One evening, as Linda scrolled through her emails, her heart sank at the subject line of a new message. "Aslan in danger? Urgent." The email was from Grace. "Linda, we've received reports that someone has been trying to bribe staff at the sanctuary to sabotage Aslan's care. We don't know who's behind it, but given the attention his story has received, it's clear someone wants to discredit the sanctuary, or worse. We're increasing security, but I thought you should know. Stay vigilant. Grace." Linda's hands trembled as she reread the message. Memories of the threats she had received during their fight against Oakwood flooded her mind, and a familiar wave of fear rose in her chest. Mark entered the room, immediately noticing her pale expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Linda handed him the phone. As he read the email, his jaw tightened, and a steely resolve replaced his worry. "We're not letting this happen," Mark said firmly. "Whoever's behind this, they won't win." The next morning, Linda called Grace to discuss the situation in detail. "We've already contacted the authorities," Grace said. "They're investigating, but without concrete evidence, it's hard to pinpoint who's responsible." Linda frowned, pacing the kitchen. "Do you think it's someone connected to Oakwood?" "It's possible," Grace admitted. "But it could also be someone with an agenda against sanctuaries or wildlife rehabilitation in general. Aslan has become a symbol, and not everyone supports what he represents." Linda's stomach churned at the thought. "What can we do to protect him?" "For now, we're monitoring everything closely," Grace said. "But if you hear or see anything suspicious, let us know immediately." That evening, Linda shared the news with Mark and Sarah. While she tried to keep her explanation simple for Sarah's sake, the seriousness of the situation wasn't lost on the little girl. "Why would anyone want to hurt Aslan?" Sarah asked, her voice small and confused. Linda knelt beside her, taking her hands gently. Sometimes people do bad things because they're scared or because they don't understand. But we're going to make sure Aslan stays safe. Okay? Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with determination. I'll help. I can draw signs to tell people to leave him alone. Linda smiled, her heart aching at her daughter's innocence. That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. The following weeks were tense as the sanctuary increased its security measures and the investigation continued. Linda found herself on edge, jumping at every unfamiliar car that passed their house and scanning her emails for updates from Grace. Mark, meanwhile, threw himself into preparations for Aslan's next visit. He built additional barriers and reinforced their backyard setup, his actions speaking louder than words as he worked to ensure the lion's safety. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Linda turned to him, her voice hesitant. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Fighting so hard for Aslan, even when it feels like the world is against us. Mark looked at her, his expression unwavering. I think Aslan is worth every fight, every sacrifice. He's not just a lion, Linda. He's part of this family. And we don't give up on family. Linda felt tears prick her eyes at his words, a mix of gratitude and pride swelling in her chest. The night before Aslan's scheduled visit, Linda received another email from Grace. This time, the news was more alarming. Linda, we've had a breach. Someone attempted to cut the locks on Aslan's enclosure, but they were caught on camera and scared off by security before they could get inside. The footage is grainy, but we've handed it over to the authorities. We're still moving forward with tomorrow's visit. But I wanted you to be aware, Grace. Linda read the email aloud to Mark, her voice shaking. They're getting bolder, she said, her fear evident. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. We'll be ready. They won't get near him. The morning of Aslan's visit was filled with a mix of excitement and tension. Grace and her team arrived with heightened security, ensuring that every precaution was taken. Aslan seemed unfazed by the added measures, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the anxiety surrounding him. As Sarah greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, Linda found herself scanning the perimeter, her eyes alert for anything out of place. Mark joined her, his voice low. You think they'd actually try something here? I don't know, Linda admitted, but I'm not taking any chances. Aslan's visit unfolded smoothly, with Sarah once again sharing her drawings and playing games with the lion. But as the afternoon wore on, a strange noise caught Linda's attention. A faint rustling from the tree line beyond their property. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice tense. Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. Grace, noticing their concern, approached quickly. What's going on? There's someone out there, Mark said, his tone grim. Without hesitation, Grace signaled to her team, who moved swiftly to secure Aslan and usher Sarah inside. Mark grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the edge of the yard, Linda close behind him. Be careful, she whispered, her heart pounding. As they reached the tree line, the rustling grew louder. Mark shone the flashlight into the trees, revealing a figure darting through the shadows. Hey! Mark shouted, his voice firm. Stop right there. The figure froze for a moment before bolting deeper into the woods. Mark started to pursue, but Linda grabbed his arm. Let them go, she said. It's not worth the risk. Mark hesitated before nodding, his jaw tight with frustration. Back at the house, Grace and her team reviewed the security footage while Sarah sat with Aslan, her presence soothing the lion's growing agitation. Whoever that was, they knew what they were doing, Grace said, her expression grim. But they didn't count on us being ready. Linda glanced at Sarah and Aslan, her resolve hardening. They can try all they want. We'll protect him, no matter what. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Together, as the sun set and Aslan was safely transported back to the sanctuary, Linda felt a mix of relief and determination. The fight to protect him wasn't over, but their family was stronger than ever, and together, they would face whatever came next. The morning dawned quiet and golden, the kind of serene day that belied the turbulence of the past few months. Linda stood in the kitchen, sipping her coffee as sunlight spilled through the window. She watched Sarah in the backyard, her little girl laughing as she chased bubbles that floated lazily through the air. For the first time in a long while, Linda felt a flicker of hope that everything might finally settle. But she couldn't ignore the knot of tension in her stomach. The encounter in the woods during Aslan's last visit had shaken her, and while no further incidents had occurred, the memory lingered like a shadow. Mark entered the kitchen, setting his coffee cup on the counter. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice soft. Linda shrugged, her gaze still on Sarah. "It's hard to believe we're here. After everything." Mark leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "You've fought harder than anyone else would have, Linda. No matter what happens, Aslan's safe because of you. Because of us," Linda corrected, meeting his eyes. Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah, because of us." Later that day, Linda received a call from Grace. "We have good news," Grace said, her voice bright. The authorities identified the person behind the breach during Aslan's last visit. It was a former Oakwood employee. Linda's stomach tightened. Did they say why? Apparently, they were trying to sabotage Aslan's success story. They claimed the attention he's gotten makes the sanctuary look bad by comparison, Grace explained. "But don't worry. They've been arrested, and there's no evidence of a larger conspiracy." Linda exhaled, relief washing over her. "That's a weight off my shoulders. Thank you for letting me know." "There's one more thing," Grace added, her tone lighter. "We've decided that Aslan is ready for a more permanent arrangement with your family." Linda's heart skipped a beat. "You mean?" "We'll still be his primary caregivers, of course," Grace said. "But he'll spend more time with you under controlled conditions. His bond with Sarah is too important to ignore, and we think it's the best thing for both of them." Tears welled in Linda's eyes. "Thank you, Grace. You have no idea what this means to us." When Linda shared the news with her family, Sarah squealed with delight, throwing her arms around her mother. "Does this mean Aslan can come visit whenever he wants?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Not quite," Linda said, laughing. "But it does mean he'll be here more often, and we'll get to spend more time with him." Mark smiled, ruffling Sarah's hair. "Guess we'd better get the backyard ready again." "Huh?" The first of Aslan's extended visits was scheduled for the following week. Linda and Mark worked tirelessly to prepare, reinforcing the backyard and setting up new enrichment items for the lion. Sarah helped wherever she could, her excitement infectious. When the day finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Aslan was brought to their home with a small team of sanctuary staff, and his arrival felt like a reunion. "Hi, Aslan," Sarah called, running to greet him. Aslan approached the fence with his usual calm grace, his amber eyes lighting up at the sight of Sarah. She reached through the bars to brush her fingers against his mane, giggling as he let out a soft rumble. The day unfolded beautifully, filled with laughter and play. Aslan explored the backyard, batting at his toys and soaking in the sun. Sarah sat by the fence, talking to him as though he were a lifelong friend. At one point, Mark joined her, sitting cross-legged on the grass. He reached out tentatively, his hand brushing against the lion's mane. "You're not so bad, are you?" Mark said with a small smile. Aslan let out a contented purr, his eyes half closed in relaxation. Linda watched from the porch, her heart full as she saw her family fully united for the first time in years. That evening, as the sun set and Aslan was prepared for transport back to the sanctuary, Sarah hugged her stuffed lion tightly, her eyes glistening with tears. "Do you have to go, Aslan?" she asked softly. Grace knelt beside her, her voice gentle. "He'll be back soon, Sarah. And he knows how much you love him." Sarah nodded, sniffling. "Okay, but I'll miss him." Aslan leaned against the fence, his massive head low, as though sensing her sadness. Linda crouched beside her daughter, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll see him again soon, sweetheart. And every time he visits, it'll feel just as special." Sarah smiled through her tears, hugging her mother tightly. That night, as the family sat together in the living room, a sense of peace settled over them. The battles they had fought, the pain, the doubt, the fear, had all led them to this moment. Mark glanced at Linda, his expression thoughtful. I never thought this is where we'd end up, he said. Neither did I, Linda admitted. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. Mark nodded, his voice soft. Me neither. As Sarah dozed off on the couch, clutching her stuffed lion, Linda and Mark sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Somewhere under the same stars, Aslan rested in his sanctuary, a symbol of love, resilience, and the bond that had brought a broken family back together. Their story wasn't over. It was simply entering a new chapter. But for now, they could rest, knowing that they had found their way back to each other, stronger than ever.